All right, so here's our next big feature. We'll display all the journal entries from the database on the index page. So we're going to create a div, and I'm going to call it entries. That will allow us to style everything in this div. Um, all right, we need to put some JavaScript code in this EJS file because we're going to pass a variable to this EJS file called entries. Actually, let's pause here. I think I went about this the wrong way. Let's take a step back. Sorry. Um, let's start on the server side, like with the router. So let's go back to router.js. Apologies for the detour. Um, let's focus first on how do we get the entries out of the database? How do we store them in a variable that references an array of all those entries? And then how do we pass that to our EJS file to like format it nicely? So we're going to change route.get, like this function. We're going to update this function to actually get all the entries. This is going to require communicating with the database. So we're going to have to make this arrow function definition asynchronous. So let's add the async keyword there because I forget it all the time. We can keep logging the path. That's fine. But now let's actually write code to get the entries out of the database. We've done this before. We did this a couple weeks ago when we first learned about Mongo. Um, even though we're using Mongoose, it's very, very similar, but easier than what we had to do a couple of weeks ago. So I think you'll appreciate how Mongoose makes our life easier. We're going to create a variable called entries, and we want this variable to refer to all of the entries in the collection. And we'll do await because we actually want to get the entries. We don't want just a promise. And we'll do entry.find. A couple weeks ago when we first learned Mongo, we did the find function on our like Mongo connection object to find all the documents in the collection. We're now doing the find function on the entry model. And so what this does differently is we actually get an array of entry objects. It converts everything from the document in MongoDB into JavaScript objects that we can immediately work with. So this is like super easy. In the lab practicum, you wrote like map code, right? You had to take the planets or whichever database you're using and map them to objects, and you had to do all that work. We don't have to do any of that work with Mongoose, which is super nice. So this one line of code gives us an array of all of the entry objects in our document or in our collection already. That said, we do want to do some conversion of those objects into things that will be more friendly for our EJS code, which will enable upcoming features. So we're going to convert MongoDB objects to objects formatted for the EJS template. For example, your journal entry might be an entire paragraph. We don't want to display an entire paragraph on the index page. We just want like the first part of it, right? We also need to make sure we keep track of like a unique identifier for each journal entry, because eventually we're going to be doing things like editing them, deleting them, stuff like that. So I'm going to say const formatted entries, because these are like formatted for our file. We're going to do an entries.map like we're accustomed to. We'll write an arrow function that takes one parameter, which is the entry one at a time. And this arrow function will return a new JavaScript object with an ID property, which is entry._ID. You may remember that every document in our Mongo database is automatically assigned an _ID property. That's a unique identifier for that document. We're going to use that so we can track the document in the journal entry over time. We do want the date, but the date when we store it in MongoDB is going to be, ooh, I better check my notes. This is a little tricky. No, this might work. Um, we want it, we don't, by default, when we store stuff in MongoDB, it's stored in what's called UTC time, which is very similar to Greenwich Mean Time, like the time in London, England. Um, that's confusing to us because we don't want our dates and times to look like we submitted them in the afternoon when we were in class in the morning. So we want to change the format to be local time. And the way we do that is we say entry.date because we specified we were storing date objects into the Mongo database, but we're going to change it to say to locale date string. And what this does is it formats, it takes the JavaScript date object, converts it to a string where the date and the time reflects the current locale, meaning us here in Chicago, not London. The server. Yes, that is a huge problem. Um, it gets more complicated. Yeah, either you have to do it client side, which means you can't do it in the EJS file because that's rendered server side, or you have some sort of like user preference where you keep track of their time zone so you can still do it server side. We run into this when we start hosting our apps on AWS because the AWS server is not in our time zone. And so, for example, at the start of this school year, if you paid close attention to the bus app, the times in the bus app were all wrong. They were off by like 5 or 6 hours because they were in GMT time and not Chicago time. And so we had to fix that bug the first couple days of school. But we never picked up on that bug because when you run your servers here in the classroom, they're in Chicago and the client's in Chicago and everything works out. Date and time is a nightmare for software. It's crazy how complicated and a pain it is to deal with. So yeah, that's definitely an issue, and we're not going to worry about that today. No, I'll have to check that out. I bet I can empathize with it. I can't think of how many days of my life I've wasted with code related to times and dates, and oh my goodness. All right. Um, ID, date, habit is straightforward. Here's the content thing that we want to change. We're going to use the slice command, um, which is like the one in Python, to just slice the first 20 characters of the content. And then we're going to add like dot, dot, dot at the end to show like we've truncated the content that the user has typed in. So we've taken the object from MongoDB. We've made some adjustments to make it more appropriate for formatting on the client page, and we'll go from there. We still want to render the index page, but we need to pass this variable in like we did before. And so within within the EJS file, we'll refer to it just as entries, but the variable here is formatted entries. So again, I'm purposefully naming these different just to help reinforce that this is the variable name that we'll reference in the EJS file, and the value of the variable in the EJS file will be the same as the value of this variable formatted entries in our router.js file. Part of what makes web apps complicated, I think, is we're so accustomed to writing code like in a single file. And if you have a bug, the bug is probably close to somewhere in that file. It's so much harder with web apps because we have the client side JavaScript, we have the EJS code, we have the server side JavaScript. Any given bug, like it's not working to write to the database, it could be in any of those three locations, which makes it really hard. Question? For now, we're going to print everyone's journal entries. Next week in the summative lab, we'll add more features. But for now, we're just going to print everybody's. All right, so now let's go to the EJS file. I kind of got ahead of myself earlier. We added this div for class entries. That's great. Now I think it makes more sense to write our JavaScript for loop. So again, to embed JavaScript, we do less than percent for let entry of entries. So standard JavaScript stuff here. We do the opening bracket, and then we do percent greater than to close that out. So it's kind of formatted weird. We're going to create another div of class entry. All of this stuff is so we can do formatting in our style sheet. Within that class, we're going to create another div. And here I want to put, we're going to start with the date of the entry. So remember to embed one of our EJS variables inside of our EJS file. We do less than percent equal sign, and then I can do entry.date, and then percent greater than to end that. So that puts the date in that div. And then we're going to create another div where the class is going to be entry habit, again, for styling purposes, habit. And the variable in there will be the embedded variable entry.habit. And then finally, I think finally, we'll do a div of class entry content. Content. I got to keep all my quotes correct. And then inside of here, we'll do entry content. Eventually, we want to add support for editing entries. I don't think we're going to get to that today, but let's at least put in the button while we're here. So we're going to add one more div. And this div, we're going to do another one of those anchor tags with a link, so ahref. And the page we're going to go to is the edit entry page. But actually, it's going to be /edit entry. And then we're going to concatenate onto this by using that embedded EJS variable syntax, the ID of the entry. And if you're like, what? How does that work? That's going to be for Monday. But we are going to make it with a roll of buttons so we can use the Pico styling, and with a class of secondary, more Pico styling. That's going to change the color for us. And I'll save this so it all fits and you can see it better. And we're going to call our button edit. All right, so then we close out the A tag. And we close out the div, and we close out the other div. And then we need to close. I always forget this. We've got to put that closing bracket for our for loop. Okay, and it's got to be in the right place. We still have another closing div and another main. So it's right here, lines up with closing the opening bracket for the for loop. If you want, you can go, well, let's refresh this just for kicks. When you refresh it, it's going to look like this. And this is what I want you to screenshot and submit for today. It doesn't look good. Okay, I know that. But I'll go back to the code for you all. It doesn't look good yet, but on Monday we'll make it. All right, so last time we were in the process of making the index page actually have all of the habit of mind journal entries on it. And so we reuse some of the functions we used before, but in a slightly different way because we're now using the Mongoose model. So here's where we retrieve an array of all of the entries from the database, but they're returned as an array of entry objects because we're using Mongoose now and not accessing the document directly through the MongoDB module. We reformatted those to get them ready to display in a nicer way on the page. and to like truncate the content, which can be kind of long. And then we, much like we did with create entry in terms of how we passed a variable into the EJS file, we did the same thing here when for the index file now. And then we kind of ran out of time. Well, I guess we updated the EJS file. So let's take a quick look at that. So we did do all of this stuff for the EJS file, which is great. Something seems off here. I don't think we're supposed to have this underscore here, actually. Let's go back and look at server.js. I'm sorry, router.js. Uh, no, it's just ID without an underscore. I might have been thinking about the name of the property that's part of the mongoose object as opposed to the property that we defined in our object here. So that's a mistake on my part. So let's go back to index.ejs. I just happen to notice skimming through this. This should be just entry.id. So sorry about that. But what you might remember is when we then displayed this in Chrome, it looked awful because we hadn't done any of the styling yet. So let's do that now. So we're going to go up to styles.css. This is where previously we had added some selectors for our navigation bar. Now we're going to add some stuff for the entries. So I know it's been like a couple of days. Classes that are involved here is we have the class entry for each individual entry. So we're going to apply some styling for that basically row. And then we're going to also have some styling for entry habit, which is the habit of mind that we're specifying, and then also for entry content. So we're going to focus on these three classes now: entry, entry habit, and entry content. And a lot of this is focused on using Flexbox for our layout. So in styles.css, we're going to start by doing .entry. So again, we're not selecting based on an element at all. We're selecting based on the class entry. So there's nothing before the dot. It's just .entry. We are using the display model, or rather the display model we're using is Flex. Our Flex direction is row because we have a row with several elements in it. So we're going to focus on the styling for that row. We want everything to fit on a single row. We don't want it to go onto a second row. So we will set Flex wrap to no wrap. In terms of each individual element, our justify content, we're going to set to Flex start. So we get things aligned to the left, I think. But each item, like vertically, we will center. We want to leave some gap between each item so things aren't scrunched together. 10 pixels should look nice. And then finally, we're going to add a border element. We're going to have a black border that's 1 pixel wide and it's solid so that each entry kind of is set apart from other entries. In the future, if you're working with some of the Flex stuff and you're struggling because there's so many properties related to Flex, do go back and look at that previous lesson where we did things related to Flexbox layout. There's the game, but there's also that one reference blog post that was interactive, which is fantastic. So, all right, 2 more selectors. Let's do entry habit. So this is for the habit of mind, like learning continuously. We're just going to set the flex basis property to 200 pixels. This will control the width of that, I believe, if I recall correctly. That's not super helpful. I'm pretty sure it's the width. Let's double check. You can always hover on something and then click on MDN reference, which is great. And opened up in a different window. We'll open it up here. And then, so the initial main size of a flex item, size of the content box unless otherwise specified. And sometimes they even have like a demo here, which is nice. So you can see the difference between auto, 0, and 200 actually setting it specifically. So kind of cool. So I usually have to go to the Mozilla Developer Network because I don't remember what all these things do. Um, Last one, entry content. Dot entry content. Here we want to do flex grow and set that to 1. So I stopped all my servers. You probably did as well. So if I restart my node server, that looks good. It's connected to the database. It's listening. Go up here and switch to node client. Start it. I have an old one running. Do I though? I don't know if that's true. I don't. It's just confused. All right. Debug anyway. This looks better. I mean, it's not great, but it's better, right? We got like a border around it. Here's all the dates. Here's the habit of mind. So we limited it to 200 pixels and then it wraps as necessary here. And then here's the journal entry truncated with a little dot, dot, dot under it. And then the edit should show up on the far right side. If yours looks a little bit different, it's probably just something within the style piece here, most likely, or oops, um, one of the classes isn't quite right for this part here. So, um, but what we have one more step which we want to do here, which is right now these buttons won't do anything. If I click on this button, we're just going to get an error saying we can't get edit entry. And then look at this. This is the ID, right? It's this globally unique identifier for the document in the Mongo database. It's a great way to refer to like that object. But as you see, it's not very user friendly, but that's fine. So what I'm going to show you now is how can we write a route that can be flexible so that it can respond to any document ID here, and then do something with that particular habit of mind entry. So let's do that, and then we'll have like a nice feature part here. So we're not going to display it on the page. We're just going to log it to the console for now. Making it actually show up on the page and be editable is going to be an exercise left for you all later this week as part of the summative lab. So we'll just do our part for now. So let's go back to router.js. We already have routes for the, here's the route to get the index page. Here's the route to get the create entry page. Here's the route to post to create entry. So we're going to add a new route here. So we'll do route.get. And here we're going to do /edit entry. That's what we put inside of our link. But then we're going to do /:ID. Here I'm going to hit tab because that's close to right. So we're going to do /:ID. This is the new thing that we're learning about today. By putting the colon here, we're specifying that this is a variable, basically. So this route will match anything that starts with /edit entry/ and then is followed by something. In addition, whatever the rest of that path is will be stored in a variable called ID that we can then use to do operations within the function that we have associated with this route. Okay. We do need this function to be asynchronous because we're going to contact the database. As always, it has 2 parameters, the request and the response. What we want to do is to actually find the specific document or the specific entry object, let's say, in the Mongo database. So we're going to do entry find by ID. This is a new function for us we haven't used before. It takes 1 argument, which is the ID of the object to find. And so this ID here, as part of our path, we access it by doing rec.params.id. So it will, for this type of a variable path feature, it always starts rec.params, and then this matches this. So I could call this anything. I could call this :banana, and then this would be params.banana. Okay, that's an important connection to make there. Again, common theme as we're doing this web app development is part of what makes this challenging is the flow of execution and the association between variables is a little bit less connected, right? It's not as straightforward as what we're used to. There's these kind of loose connections, like this word is what makes this variable work. So, all right, so this line of code will query the database for the ID, return a reference to that object, which is super convenient. We're not going to do all this rendering stuff. That's going to be left for you. We're just going to do console.log, and we're just going to log the entry to the console. And then we're going to do res.send, and we're going to send the entry back just as like text. In the summative lab, you will actually make this a full-fledged page where we can edit the entry. Maybe we want to revise. Maybe we typed in the wrong date. Maybe we want to add more detail to the content, whatever it happens to be. But for now, this will work fine. So I'm going to switch back to our app, go back to the index page, refresh it just to make sure everything is here. I'm going to click on one of these entries, and sure enough, it's just showing us the JSON. So here's the ID of the object, here's the date of the object, the email, the habit, and the content, right? So pretty nice. So we'll pause here.